The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Nick Cortina. I'm very excited to be bringing you another support lab today. And so before we keep going, you folks know the drill. If we could just post a Q or a Q, a Y or a yes in the questions pane. Maybe I don't know the drill. Just let me know you guys can hear me okay before we get started into some great content here, all about repeating data. Awesome, and it looks like I'm getting those Ys coming through. Everyone can hear me okay. And so to kick things off, repeating data. Why might we see repeating data, and what can we as report designers actually do about it? Obviously, we don't need to see, sort of the same thing over and over again. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what might be causing those things, whether it's the given categories we've selected for a report, potentially some join criteria or something there, and then what exactly we might be able to do about it. We'll talk a little bit about some of our duplicate suppression options, and we're going to look at some grouping pieces there as well. Now, finally, before we do get any further here, I just want to give a quick shout out to our next lab that's going to be on April 18th. That'll be all about folder management. That's going to be delivered by our very own Travis McGrath, so be sure to sign up for that. And on that note, I'm going to navigate over to a local installation of Exago to get things started here. So for today's lab, we're actually going to start by building an example report from scratch. Never hurts to just kind of review some basics here. So I'm going to start by moving over to my left-hand side, and I'm going to use the plus icon to create a new report. I'm going to go into this build category, and I'm going to select a new advanced report to kick things off here. So for this report's name, I'm going to call it repeating data example. I'm going to save it in this training folder for now. We could enter in a description if we'd like. Again, this part's optional, so I'll leave that just for a moment, and I'm going to go to the categories menu here. So I actually want to pause here for just a second. With the categories menu, one of the key things that I've noticed, or one of the pitfalls, I should say, that some folks get a little tripped up on is it's not always going to be beneficial to add more categories to a given report. And just to be clear, I don't mean to say that, hey, if I wanted to show some information about employees, their orders, and some of those order details, right, by all means, we should just pull each and every one of those categories over, include them all in the report. But what I would say is sort of a misstep here is if I know that I'm going to get some employees info, some orders info, some order detail information as well, I don't necessarily need, say, the customers category here. And so that's sort of what I'm trying to get at this point, is that if we do have, all the categories that we need on the report, there's not really a good reason to have any extraneous categories on the report. In fact, it can even be potentially a detriment. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to see here in just a second. So I'm actually going to remove these categories again. And let's pretend for a moment that we're actually going to start by going through and maybe just generating a report that shows us a simple list of our associated employees. So at this point, I've got the employees category and only the employees category on this report. I'll navigate to my sorts menu. And so here we're choosing how the data is ordered. And I'm thinking that for the moment, I'm going to drag in this last name field. So above all else, the information coming back will be sorted by the last name. We'll go to our filters tab, and for this exercise, I'm not going to filter any information out. I just want to take a look at that full data set. And finally, I'll get to the layout tab. So this is where we're picking the information that's actually going to be displayed on the report. And we're talking about just seeing a simple list of employees. So on that note, I'm going to take the first name field. I'll double click to add that to my data fields pane. And I'll grab that last name field too. And in the little preview below, it looks like we're going to see some first and last names for each of those employees. And again, for this simple example, I'm actually just going to go ahead and hit finish. So we'll exit the wizard. We're in the full-fledged advanced report designer. And at this point, I'm just going to go ahead and execute this report. Now, on finishing that execution, you could see it was pretty quick there, just on the order of 10 different employees that came back. We can see there's again, just about 10 employees in this Northwind data set. You might even notice a few that I've added here, some interesting folks, Steve Irwin, Michael Jordan, probably not in the standard Northwind data set, but we got to add some fun folks in here somehow, right? Now, we've got just on the order of 10 rows, and that's all well and good because we're just pulling information from that employees category. Now, if we navigate back, and for just a second here, I'm actually going to change the output, this specific output, just make this red so we can remember that this was the first execution we did with just that single category. I'm going to navigate back to the report designer. We're going to go to our options cogwheel. We'll go to the categories menu. And if I take this orders category and I drag it over to the right-hand side, and all I've done at this point is I've added the ability for me to select fields from this category. I'll hit OK, and I'm not going to change anything else on this report. We're not touching those sorts again. We're not modifying the output here at all. Nothing else is changing. If I execute this report one more time, all of a sudden we notice 12 pages of information, and we're seeing this first and last name repeated however many times. Now, comparing that back to the initial one, right, we're all probably thinking, hey, wait a minute, why are we just seeing the first and last name however many times repeated? And, that's a great question. And really the key thing to consider here is simply by adding that category, and I just navigated back to my editor just so we could look at this categories menu again, simply bringing this category into the report makes this report say, hey, I'm not just looking at the employees category anymore. Now I'm looking at the full data set that's included not just in employees, but also in orders. And considering that for any given employee, they're probably going to have on the order of, more than just one order, or at least we would hope so, right? Our employees certainly are probably pushing out just more than a single order in their data set that we have. That means that employee information is going to get repeated because there's going to be many different rows with different order information that all could be related to the same given employee. Now, with that in mind, there's one other thing I'd actually like to do here, just for the purpose of the illustration. I'm going to insert a new column to the right of column B. And I think for just a second, what I want to actually do is I'm going to use our search feature. I'm going to go grab this order ID field. And I'm just clicking and dragging. I'm going to put it over right in cell C4 here. And again, this is the detail section. So this guy's returning us one row for each row returned from the data source. So by including this order ID here, and again, let's just make this nice and clear. I'm going to add a quick little header here, just so that it's clear what information is being displayed here. And we could stretch this guy out to, why not? If we execute this report one more time, now we can see that for each of these rows where before we were saying, hey, wait a minute, why do we see Stephen Buchanan over and over? Why do we see Laura Callahan over and over? Now we can see that, between some of these rows, order information is different. And despite the fact that in the previous execution, we didn't include that order info, the detail section is still saying, hey, these two rows are different. I need to show two different rows between the first and second row for Steve Buchanan, and the first and any of the given rows, I should say here. And at this point, right, we're starting to get to the point where we want to take a look and see, what could we do to better handle a situation like this, where we need to just display some of this information. But just before we do that, there is one other piece I want to touch on before we start tackling some of the ways we can better handle repeated information. Now, this is again going to be in our options cogwheel, but it's actually a little bit separate from the categories. If we navigate down to this advanced menu, and I should pause, it's quite possible that your administrators have not configured and enabled access to what I'm about to show. If you're following along or you go to do this on your own after the lab or something of the sort, and you click this options cogwheel and you say, hey, wait a minute, I don't even see this advanced menu, or maybe I do, but I don't have access to this joins menu. I would say then this piece is not as critical for you. It's not going to be as important. That said, for anyone who does have access to this menu, and to take that a step further, to anyone that has access to this menu and has been directed to manually specify the join criteria. And just to be clear, this is not something that's critical to do even if we have access to this menu. This is something that should only be done by folks who say, I know that I need to go in and specify this join criteria. Unless I do so, I'm not going to get the data set that I'm looking for. If that is the case, I would say specifying a join here that is incorrect. So if we come in and we try to specify a join path, or a relationship, I should say, between two categories, and we get it incorrect or we get it wrong, that means the resulting data set that comes back can be grossly incorrect as well. And so again, just to reiterate, this isn't meant to be a discussion on joins, obviously. We're talking about the repeating data component. But if we have been directed as a report designer to manually specify these joins, if we know that we need to go in here and this is a critical step to accurately creating the reports, my recommendation would be to say, hey, if you're using employees and orders, send a quick email over to your database administrator and say, hey, what's the relationship between orders and employees? What's the join criteria that I need to input? And make sure that we have that information before going in and trying this, because really going in and trying to check the boxes or pick the right join criteria here, it's not something that's easily guessed. And if we try to do something like that, if we try to guess and sort of check our work in that regard, there's no guarantee that the information will come out correctly. Furthermore, it might come out looking correctly for one execution, but be incorrect down the road after some new data is entered or something like that. So again, if we're going to go in and do these joins, that's not to say we have to, but if we've been directed to by our administrators, we want to make sure we know what that join criteria is ahead of time to prevent instances where we see garbage output. So with that piece out of the way, we know that executing this report is going to show us the first and last names for the employee information repeated for each given order for that employee. So what can we do to better handle that? What can we do to maybe clean up that output a little bit? The first thing we could do is actually select a cell that includes one of the fields that we know is being repeated. So let's take first name in this instance. And with that cell selected, I can use this icon here to suppress duplicated values from appearing later on in the report. And so I think the easiest way to kind of illustrate this is to just actually execute the report again, right? And at this point, we can see that all of the first names are only going to show up once for each given Northwind employee. Now, this can be a little handy tool, right? Particularly if we're just showing information in the detail section. But there is an important consideration here. We know that the Northwind data set only has on the order of 10 employees, right? If we toggle back here, we can see that from our first execution. But what if we bump into instances where 2 employees have the same first name? Suppressing duplicated values there might suppress a first name value that we maybe in fact don't actually want to suppress. And so when we think about using this suppress duplicate feature, we need to consider the fact that this isn't looking at anything like unique identifiers for rows or any of that nice stuff that the database can use to say, hey, is this a unique row or not? This is simply going to look at the actual values displayed in the cell. So if we choose to use this feature, which we certainly can given the right circumstances, we want to ensure that whatever we're selecting to suppress, those values should actually be suppressed if we find the same value once again. So really the key thing is, hey, are these going to be things like first names where we could have the same first name for multiple different employees? If so, perhaps suppressing the duplicates using this option isn't going to be the best way to go. I'm going to toggle that off again for a second here, because there is one other thing that we can check out. And if we were to go back into this categories menu, we noticed on the most recent execution, we just suppressed that first name, but we saw the last name being repeated over and over and over again as well. And so if we were to have, say, something like the relationship that we've got here, where one given employee is going to have multiple given orders, right? And we're just showing this information in detail. Since we know that each and every piece of employee info we include will probably be repeated over and over again, instead of specifying each individual cell, what we can do instead is check the suppress duplicates here, and this is going to basically do a blanket suppression across any items from the employee's object. So to highlight that again, after checking that suppress duplicates, I'm going to execute this report one more time, and just to be clear, we've toggled off the suppress duplicates for the first name. So at this point, we're just using that check in the categories menu. On executing, we're going to see, once again, the first name is being suppressed for each one of these employees. However, this time around, the last name is going to get suppressed as well. And that's because we chose to suppress anything that's being duplicated coming out of that employee's category. Again, however, one thing that's important to note is that both of the suppression options we've talked about thus far don't modify the data that's being returned at all. They don't modify the way that the report goes to the data source and says, hey, give me some information for me to format and display. All of the suppression here is going to happen after that data is processed, and it's all going to be based on the actual values that are being displayed in those fields. So again, while it's nicer for us to be able to check that on the category and say, hey, for all of these various employees, don't show me repeated information, we could still bump into instances where duplicated values for two separate employees, so perhaps, two folks with the last name Buchanan worked at this given company, we could still bump into issues where we're incorrectly going to suppress what appear to be duplicated values, but maybe in actuality should just be showing the same thing more than once for different entries. So with that in mind, while yes, it's great for us to be able to suppress things on an individual cell level and also to potentially do that at the category level as well, I would assert that while both options have a very specific use case and sort of a specific niche, if you will, I would say the more optimal way and the way that I would encourage you folks to think about structuring your reports to handle this sort of relationship is to consider some of the grouping options that Exago provides as an alternative. So if I were to go in and say, well, I know that for each employee, I'm showing some order info, right? Maybe it would make sense to, instead of showing that information on each actual row for each piece of order info, to instead go and add a new section. I'm going to do that by clicking on any existing section of my report. I'm going to go ahead and add a group header. Now, when we go to add either a group header or footer, what we're actually going to add it on is anything that we've added a sort field on when we initially designed our report. Now, you might be saying, well, hey, wait a minute, I didn't add a sort field, trying to follow along. No problem. If we did need to do that, we could navigate back to the cogwheel, go back to our sorts, and if I wanted to throw in, say, a sort on order ID, I could do that here. And then when I go in to do my grouping, I would have that as an option here as well. So never going to be a big deal for us to just go back, add the relevant sort so we can then group by that criteria. We do just need to keep in mind that those sorts are hierarchical, meaning that above all else, we're sorting by our last name, then by our order ID. So with the example that we're looking at here, I'm going to say it would make sense to summarize some of our information, or to maybe introduce groups of information by using a group header on the employee last name. And as I do that, we're going to see that just above my details section, we've now got this header, and I'm going to stretch this out so we can see that that says header employee's last name. So for each last name value, we're going to show one row, and that's going to be row 4. And then after that row 4 for each given last name, we'll show all of the associated details chunked out by their respective employee last name. So to tidy up this report just a little bit, we're going to move some things around before we do our next execution. So first thing I'm going to do is say, hey, if we know that we're going to introduce each chunk of detail rows with the employee's first and last name, I'm going to move that first and last name field up out of the detail section and into a row in that group header. So now each employee name, first and last name, I should say, will show up once. To take it a step further, I think I'm actually going to insert a row below row 4. I can do that by selecting any existing row and then just clicking Insert Row after. And, you know, thinking about it, we don't need this first name label or this last name label, I would say. It's going to be pretty clear what these are for this example. But I do think I'd like to pull this order ID down and over, and I'm going to move the order ID field just to the left. And we can get rid of this extra column at this point, right? I don't think we need that anymore. And, you know, I'll just do a couple little formatting things here. Let's select A4. I'm going to hold Shift and select B4. I'm going to bold these guys so they stand out a little. Maybe I up the font one. I'm going to center a line. I think what I'll do is maybe change the background to be just sort of a light blue, just kind of breezing through some little formatting pieces here. And you know what else I'm going to do? I'm going to select our detail section, go to section shading. I'm going to add just some quick alternate shading between white and gray so that it's easy for us to kind of look in and immediately pick out any given piece of an order ID here. And I think, you know, at this point, we could stretch this out a little bit, do the same in the detail rows. Maybe I center align those as well. And I think the final thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on row 4. And I'm going to select this collapse rows option. I think this is one of those hidden gems that not a lot of folks know about. So this is a great excuse to kind of throw this in here. So what have we done at this point? What's the sort of key fundamentals restructuring that we've done? We've decided that, hey, instead of showing employee first and last name in the details section, show it just once in a header on the employee last name. And in that header, we're going to have a nice little label that says, hey, when we look at all these associated detail rows, these are going to be order ID values. That's what we're looking at here. And we'll see those first and last names bolded a little bit bigger and with just a light blue background. And that's going to be what introduces each new collection of order IDs for each employee. So we did all those modifications right, a little bit of nice formatting in there just to give it a bit more of that aesthetic edge, if you will. And on finishing the execution, we can see that, hey, we actually kind of came full circle where, you know, this initial execution where we just showed, hey, these are the list of employees we got something pretty similar, except this time around, we've still got all that associated order information. We can just click the drop downs here in the interactive HTML to see all of those associated orders. And the nice part here is, you know, we could click into any of these different sales folks that we wanted to see that associated info for. But at the end of the day, it's nice and clean. There's just a simple list of employees. All of the associated detail info is still there. We can click any of these little collapsible group options to see it. And at the end of the day, I think the key is that looking at all the detail information, we see this employee info that normally was repeated however many times on each row once to introduce each new grouping of information here. And I am seeing some questions about some folks who missed the part where we did the collapsible group, so I'm just going to take that step one more time. And so navigating back here, it is a little difficult to see. And I think what I'll actually do for just a second here is I'm going to zoom in. If we notice on row 4, this little gray arrow in the bottom right, that's actually denoting that I've got the collapsible groups enabled on this row here. And so if I click on this row, we're going to notice that down near our suppress and page break options, this is where that collapse rows comes into play as well. So if I were to uncheck that and we executed the report again, we would see, once again, 12 pages of information. And I'm going to zoom back out for just a second here. And so, maybe not as clean as using that collapse groups option, but we still have alleviated that repeating information on each row. That said, if we navigate back to the designer just one more time, I'm going to click on row 4 in my group header. I'm going to hit that collapse rows option. And once again, we'll run that report one more time. And now we can see that we've got that nice collapsing feature that we saw in that other execution. We had another question come in that if we collapse the rows, does that change the export for PDF and Excel? And so for PDF and Excel, if we do have the collapse option enabled, that actually just shouldn't take effect in that given output. And so we can just go ahead and do a quick export to PDF. But I believe what we should be seeing here is basically just the full output without the collapse groups. So the collapse groups is really only going to be something that we get to utilize and take advantage of in the interactive HTML. That said, including it on a given report shouldn't actually hinder our ability to push the output to either Excel, PDF, or any of the other downloadable export types there. All right, and that is going to be all of the content that we've planned to show on the lab today. We're definitely going to stick around for a few extra minutes, make sure we handle any other last minute questions anybody has. I do also just want to say that when the lab finally finishes, be sure to fill out that after lab survey and let us know what end user topic you'd really like to see coming up in May. We've got gauges in interactive HTML that we're looking to prep for you guys. We'd love to know which one you folks are a little bit more excited about. So let us know in the after lab survey. And as always, happy reporting. So we did have a question come in that I figure for anybody who's sticking around, I'll answer for the group. If we wanted to use collapse group options, should we be using them on a dashboard at runtime? And I think this is a great question and a good question to help me clarify just a little bit. So if I navigate back to that report here, and let's go back to the HTML. This is actually something that we can see in the interactive HTML viewer, even outside of a dashboard execution. So if, and at this point, I'm going to speak to just a couple technical pieces, just for some clarity. If we were doing something like integrating Exago in such a manner where maybe we have like a menu of reports and clicking on a specific report would simply execute that report in HTML for the user on the screen, you would still have these collapsible group options even outside of a dashboard in that manner. So if we just had that report executing, they'll get all the collapsible group options there. That said, if we did want to include this report on a dashboard, we will still have the collapsible group options in the interactive HTML of the dashboard output. The thing I just want to make sure is really clear is that this is not necessarily going to be just for a dashboard or just for the report execution. It'll work in either instance. Again, the only criteria there is that it's got to be in the actual report viewer in the web browser in HTML here. All right, folks, a lot of great questions coming in. It seems like things are dying down just a little bit, so we're going to give one more minute. If anyone has any other last-minute questions, submit them now. Otherwise, we're going to wrap things up here for today.